Doctors have read it. What was the craziest case of patient paranoia that you have ever seen? Former psych nurse here. I once had a patient who believed he was Satan. Since Satan was nude, so was he. He spent much of his time in a private, secure room, and when it was time to go for some fresh air around the unit, we had to bargain with him to wear a. Wow, so you had to make a bargain with the devil, huh? Not a doctor, but my grandfather had Lewy body dementia. Unlike other dementia, Lewy body has a strong hallucination component. Here are a few of my favorites. My grandma was having an affair with the pharmacist. She was also running a whorehouse, which would be okay, but she wouldn't give him a cut. The shadow men had built an exact replica of his house, but on wheels to use as a brothel, naturally, and were stealing his electricity to power it. That's why his switches, which powered outlets, would flip and nothing would happen. They had also dug in a basement under his house which he attempted to access one night by cutting a hole in the floor with an axe. If he took anyone looking for this alternate house, they would move it to make him look crazy. The staff at the care home he eventually was placed in was treating all the food with embalming fluid, so he couldn't eat it. He also had another doctor tell him that the medications he was on were US poisoning him and that he didn't need to take them anymore. It was a roller coaster. Not a doctor, but I work with elderly people prone to delirium. We once had an 80-year-old academic at our institute. I think he was some sort of professor and obviously well-spoken, also mostly appeared to be very lucid at first glance. For months he'd harbored the idea that he was at the center of an elaborate ritual conducted by a medieval sort of witch. Because of her spells, he would constantly phase in and out of consciousness, imagining to smoke a pipe and talk to people that weren't there at all and so on. He further claimed that he had found that there were pentagrams drawn in lemon juice and goat urine all over his apartment. His mouth was constantly deathly dry, because she would fill it with the ashes of cursed scrolls and parchment. The witch planned to extract something from his body to create a flying ointment or something for her broomstick. Anyways, it was absolutely wild and nonsensical. The crazy thing was, his delusions turned out to be warranted. It was later found that his granddaughter for months had actually tried to poison him with incrementally increasing doses of belladonna extract. Well, in the medieval times, people believed that witches could fly only if they put a flying ointment, usually made from human flesh bones, on their broomstick. And the stuff about goat urine, pentagrams and ashes are also historically accurate. So, his delirium made sense. From a mythological point of view. Psych nurse. Had a patient that thought that the queen was a lizard person who swapped his penis with another one. Also had a patient who thought we were drugging the air through the vents. Oh, and someone who thought his cat was spying, stalking him for Trump. Student nurse here, but I still go to the hospital for internships. Had a patient come to the emergency room with really high blood sugar, type 2 diabetic. I asked her if she was taking her medications and she said that she didn't want to. Thinking she was referring to some type of bad side effect, I asked her what medication she was taking, and it was diabetes, chlorpropamide for those of you who aren't Brazilian. Pretty standard type 2 diabetes medication. Not a lot of bad side effects other than some skin rashes. I asked her why she wasn't taking the pills and she said, "Look at the name. I can't take something that has diabo devil in Portuguese in the title. If I have to go, I shall go without any contact with these devilish chemicals, like the Lord intended." It was hard not to laugh at that one, but I kept my shit together. When I was going through ambulance school, there was an old woman whose legs were basically rotting off and she was dying in the emergency room. She was convinced she was in Germany and that we were literal Nazis torturing her. I had to hold her down while a doctor stuck her or something. It was pretty shitty feeling, and not even the worst thing I saw that night. I'm an ambulance scribe. The most paranoid patients I've seen are the ones who are very, very high on meth. Usually it involves them believing that bugs are crawling on or out of their skin. Don't do meth or heroin. Those drugs are bad MK. Oh, I forgot. There was another meth patient who decided to take out his teeth with a butter knife. He partially succeeded. I'm in dermatology. There are a lot of people who think they have bugs in their skin. A lot of them aren't crazy, but there is also no bugs. Often it will start with a splinter or a bug bite, and they get this idea of bugs in their skin they can't shake. Once we explain it to them and give them something to calm their peripheral nervous system, they usually do well. That said, there are also very crazy people who think they have bugs in their skin. They will bring us bags of scabs or jars of pee so we can examine them for bugs. One guy thought he had glass in his skin and brought in a whole duffel bag of Gatorade bottles filled with urine. Those cases are really sad because even though we try to refer them for the help they need, they usually just yell at us, post a bad review, and never come back. One lady used to beg us to cut open her fingers to look for them. Usually these patients will look like meth heads because they've just picked at themselves obsessively. Most of them, is safely guess, are not, but it's a sad thing to see either way. Also, sometimes they have scabies and just thinking that word makes me itch. Not a doctor, but had a geriatric patient with Lewy body dementia. She was married with kids but was in constant fear that the Federal Bureau of Investigation prison truck was there to pick her up and take her to the lesbian prison camp. Not a medical professional, however, I work in an emergency room. One patient stated that she needed to stop the destruction of the world as aliens were coming to take everyone she loved. She stated that at midnight, if she didn't get to a certain park, we're all fucked. Nurses sedated her as she began to hurt herself, slamming head into the wall. My wife is a clinician and had a person come in with the idea that Donald Trump's Twitter feed, it was actually an alien artificial intelligence that infects everyone who reads it. I really like that one. Not a doctor, but I was convinced that my ex is communicating with me through static electricity. I straight up confronted him about it. I have been diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder, which is like schizophrenia and depression in one, and I have had many delusions like this. At one time I thought my family had been replaced with clones and were out to get me. I thought they had hidden recording devices in my house and were watching me at all times. I also once thought that North Korea was planning on dropping nuclear bombs that would destroy the whole Earth, and I was the only one that could stop it by, for some ungodly reason, setting myself on fire. It's embarrassing to think back to those times. I hope you don't have to go through that again, as I know how scary it can be. Not a doctor, but I do conduct interviews in the county jail. The assessment I have to use asks about personal information, such as address, job status, income, and so on. This particular defendant stated she was a mermaid. She did not know her or her son's age, as mer people age differently than humans. She had moved to our city to receive services she could not get elsewhere, which is funny because we are a good 3 hours from the coast, and I thought she would need to be near the ocean. She would not specify the services needed. She listed her occupation as a celebrity on TV and working constantly, and only made about $300 monthly. All in all, the drugs she was addicted to really warped her reality. I had a patient who needed an orthopedic operation following a fracture, refused multiple times because he believed he had discovered a secret in the 70s and major world leaders were out to kill him to keep him quiet. He thought if he had an anesthetic that Trump or Theresa May specifically would use it as a way to kill him and cover it up. After over a week of regular psych input, he had the op-ed and it was a success. Not a doctor, but my parents threatened to take me to a psychiatrist multiple times after I tried telling them that my older sister swallowed our pet hamster. I swear I'm not making this stuff up. But now I think I sound like a crazy person to my family. While in the nursing home, my great-grandmother was convinced that the nurses were sneaking into the room at night and stealing her organs. She crocheted a lot, and she would crochet crosses and then put googly eyes on them and hang them around her room so that God could watch the nurses and stop them from stealing her organs while she slept. Dementia can be wild. Not a doctor, but a certified nursing assistant had a lady named Mary who was convinced she was being raped. As in, it was happening right then at that moment. She also would take about carrying kids across the border and bridge in the trunk. She would roll out of bed and army crawl. She couldn't walk to the door. This was the middle of the night freaky, as anything walked into the kitchen, and an 80-year-old skinny old lady is army crawling around. She was only nice to me when I would give her breathing treatment because she thought we were a drug house and I was smoking whatever with her. She would occasionally stare out the window sadly for hours, then look at me and say the wolves and fox are lining up in a circle for me. There was about a million other things. She actually sprained my co-worker's ankle by ruining it over with her wheelchair. Old lady Jad, some brute strength. and there is very little you can do to protect yourself while protecting them. Not a doctor, but my mother insisted that her health problems were because terrorists were creating biological weapons specifically targeted to only affect her, and not her lifetime of smoking, drinking, and not eating well and never exercising. Mental health is so vastly underserviced. My grandma was a nurse in a psychiatric institution. She told me she once had a patient who was persuaded to have been decapitated and would call herself Jeanne de France, in reference to Joan of Arc, I guess. Not a doctor. But my brother has been in and out of psych wards for the past 10+ years. A more positive delusion he had was that he thought that he was the incarnation of the sun god Ra, which then took a negative turn a couple weeks later as he was convinced that he died every night to be reborn in the morning, and he said this was a painful process. Then he was convinced that the Federal Bureau of Investigation was after him because he had broken through the time continuum and they didn't want him divulging any secrets. The list goes on and on. At one point he didn't recognize me or my mother or anyone else in the family and thought we were random people trying to keep him locked up so he couldn't show the world the truth. It's sad and scary to see someone you love repeatedly go through that. Mental illness isn't something I would wish on my worst enemy. My mom was a supervisor in a nursing home at the time, but she would help during the daily activities with the dementia patients. After they had finished that day's activity and they started to go back to their rooms, one little old lady is screaming at the top of her lungs. My mom rushed to her asking what's wrong, what did she need. This lady explains how someone behind the food counter is beating a dog and she hears it howling. My mom is confused because nobody is beating a dog anywhere and nobody is behind the food counter. So she goes behind the counter and mouths some random words the lady had hearing problems and points at the door for this man to leave. My mom then walks over to the lady to calm her down because she is crying at this point. The lady tells my mom to help the dog, so she pretends to pick up this dog and bring him out of the room. My mom then brings the lady to her room and helps her in bed, and she is still upset about it. My mom asks all these questions about if she's okay and what did the dog look like. If she had any dogs when she was younger to try and get her in a better mood. Nothing worked. The lady said the dog was a golden retriever, and so as it happened we had 2 golden retrievers at home. So she got a call from the night supervisor that this lady can't sleep and all she wants is the dog to be okay and happy. So my mom calls to head director of the nursing home if she can bring in one of our golden retrievers to comfort this lady after a sleepless night, and the head director said no, after a few nights if she can't sleep she'll think about my mom bringing in a dog, most likely not because of health risks to patients. After a few sleepless nights of thus poor lady, my mom is allowed to bring in our dog and hangs out with this lady the whole day, and she is so happy the entire day, and she said she hasn't had that good of a sleep after that day in forever. Not a doctor, but my friend is convinced he talks to celebrities with telepathy and Brad Pitt is his real dad. He waited all night in a hotel parking lot for Emma Watson. When it became morning and he was giving up, he seen a light turn on and in his mind turned into a sign of waiting just a few more hours. Sad, honestly. He's a great dude when he's on his medicine. My sister came to visit me in Vietnam years ago. She was so excited. She and her daughter had never traveled internationally before, so she decided to splurge and got 30-day disposable contacts so she would be mucking about with her daily disposables or her glasses the whole trip. I had already test-run epic touristy things for her to do: machine guns, elephants, monkey parks, ostrich racing, normal stuff. She tried the contacts out for 2 months before coming so she'd be used to them and put a fresh pair in the day she flew. She showed up bleary-eyed and jet-lagged, but so was her daughter. We had epic trips each day and they were both exhausted and out like lights by 6 o'clock at night. But that one eye got worse. By the 4th or 5th day it was puss-crusted and nasty looking. My sister finally fessed up a contact was stuck in her eye and infected. She showed me where it was, and when she grabbed it with 2 fingertips and pulled, it was stuck fast and wouldn't come out. So we went to my doctor and explained the situation. Doctor poked around for a bit and said nope, no contact. It must have fallen out a few days ago because it looks like you've been yanking on your cornea. Yeah, my poor sister, so excited and so paranoid, had been grabbing the actual cornea of her own eye in her 2 fingers and trying to pull it off her own eyeball until it got infected. Behavioral health technician of 9 years here. I've seen plenty of patients with acute paranoia, but the one that always sticks to me is a young guy we had about 5 years ago. Guy was about 19, normal-looking white male that had never had any previous mental health history. He was brought in after cutting his own right arm off just below the shoulder. He was the most friendly and loving patient. Always cheerful, talking with all the other patients on the unit, helping people and always saying kind things. He had just entered college and had his first schizophrenic break. Apparently he had become acting more strange to his family, saying weird things, having strange behaviors, and his dad and brother found him in the garage lying on the floor after cutting his arm off with his dad's table saw. The patient had a tattoo above his elbow on his right arm that he said had become possessed with Satan and was telling him to do harmful things to his family, so he cut it off. Still fucks with me to this day. Kid was so bright and full of love, and he's born with a disorder like this. Mental health is fucking brutal, and a lot of us take it for granted. It was one of those moments when you realize how blessed you are and go home and hug your family. I worked in mental health. We had a mental health case that spectacularly stood out. He was Ivy League educated and smart as hell. Per his account, when he was a child, he had a friend was a boy who wanted to be a girl. He was too young for gender reassignment. Our patient reportedly suggested that he just cut it off himself and that it would force a proper medical response to reassign his gender. Apparently, one day he saw an ambulance next door and he never saw his friend again. Fast forward a few decades. Our man becomes obsessed with a famous national talk show hostess. He believes she was his best childhood friend next door. He starts writing her letters, many letters. These were as crazy as you might assume, given the backstory. This talk show host ignores them, though somehow this was escalated to the Federal Bureau of Investigation on her end. Our man does not give up easily. He takes it upon himself to fly out to New York to see her in person, and begins stalking her. To determine if his friend was born male, our guy goes so far as to dress up as a woman and stalk her at her private health club, hoping to catch a glimpse of her in the locker room. This behavior was far too threatening and bizarre, and it resulted in his arrest and subsequent mental health treatment. He was still affected by this belief when we received him, even though he had been incarcerated and hospitalized for months. What was so strange is how unique he was. I worked with countless paranoid schizophrenic patients, but this man had one singular delusion and was otherwise wholly normal. But this belief was so powerful that it drove him to extremes. Not a doctor, but I work in an electronics store. A lady comes in every now and then. She's always struck me as kind of odd. Small store with a lot of the same customers. She obviously suffers from some degree of anxiety because she is very reluctant to speak and ask for help. I try my best to help her every time she comes in. One day she wants to send her phone to service repairs because she believed that the neighbors were tracking her and listening in on her phone calls and also reading her messages. She knew that because there were voices in the phone that told her so. Me and my coworkers were a little weirded out. I've heard her mention something like this before, so I wasn't too shook, but we sent it in because no matter what we said, she wanted to. A couple of weeks go by. The phone is back and she borrowed a phone from us meanwhile. When she came to get it, she was very worried because there were voices in the phone he borrowed too. We've sent the phone in for her 2 more times after that. She still wants to send it in. Probably paranoid schizophrenia or something. I feel bad for her. There was also this man who jumped around because he felt ants on him, and then proceeded to smell my hair, but he's not paranoid. Just weird, funny, and a real character. One time when I was younger, I was seriously sleep deprived and was going for a shower. Midway through the shower, I imagined my dad's crazy girlfriend, ex now thank fuck, had somehow managed to turn the water into diesel and was just waiting to set it all aflame. Never dealt with paranoia since, but sleep deprivation can really mess you up. As a psychiatrist by training, I don't even know where to start. I had an older woman, sharp as a tack when you'd speak to her, but was so paranoid in her psychosis. She thought that an old associate of hers was working for the mafia and had implanted a listening device into her ear that could also send her messages. Her family members described her house as a fortress. Because she had installed so many locks and alarm systems and covered all the electronics with foil, she eventually wouldn't go into more and more rooms in her home, thinking they were compromised and bugged in the drywall. Eventually, she was found lying outside her home in freezing temperatures because she refused to go inside. That's what led her to the psychiatric unit. Ultimately, because she was so paranoid, she wouldn't take any meds and eventually became homeless because she refused to live in her perfectly good house. I've also had several patients that have had to be placed on forced antipsychotics because they were so paranoid that they weren't eating and drinking, believing that it was poisoned, along with the medications. Paranoia is my bread and butter. I'm no doctor, but this is something my ex's father told me. He's a psychologist and had previously worked in a mental ward. They once had 3 people in the same department who were convinced they were Jesus. Hilarious shit broke out after they found about each other. Not a doctor, but a caregiver at a care home. One of our patients, a sweet lady, about 90 years old, let's call her Lisa, has severe paranoia and dementia. But one time beat it all. I was working alone in our department, 8 patients, while my colleague had his dinner break. I was serving a few other patients some night snacks and tea when I hear Lisa scream. It was blood freezing. Me and my colleague had put her to bed about half an hour earlier. Lisa lives furthest down in the corridor, approximately 3 rooms away, with closed doors and everything. I put down the last cup of coffee and pretty much runs to Lisa's room, knock on the door, unlock it, and walks in. She's facing the window blinds pulled down and screaming her lungs out. I call her name and quickly starts talking to her. As mentioned, she got bad dementia, really bad. She's on and on about some man in the window staring at her. I get up multiple times to assure her that there is no one there. She eventually calms down, but I stay and hold her hand till she falls asleep. Pace itself multiple times during the night. Eventually my colleague called the nurse on duty to ask for permission to give Lisa another sleeping pill, as her screaming wakes up the neighboring patients. Just a note, caretakers don't have the authority to make decisions regarding medicine without consulting a nurse or doctor. It was really crazy that night, and unfortunately, that man in the window is the only thing consistent in Lisa's head. I don't know what to make of it. But I'm fairly new to the job, and I probably have a lot more to experience. My father was a doctor, dermatologist. Had a patient who accused him of prescribing a non-existent experimental drug for a supposed condition that he was never diagnosed with. Tried to take him to court and lost. Sent a threatening letter after, reported to police. After the police confronted him about it, he dropped a homemade fruit basket with a single bullet on top of the fruit at the front step of the office, addressed, but not postmarked, to my father with a creepy unsigned apology note. Basket was immediately shown to police. About a month later, my father received a letter from the guy stating he had seen my name in the paper's sports section, local golf tournament results, and that he knew I would be playing at an upcoming tournament where the start times were published. There was a police presence at the tournament, something that never happens, because my father reported it. My dad's nurse's husband was a local detective and pretty much followed me the whole day with my dad. The police found the guy in the parking lot unarmed and he was arrested, then eventually committed to a psych hospital for some time. There's still a restraining order against him to this day, but this was over 15 years ago and the guy seems to have disappeared. I didn't know any of this until about 5 years ago, but I remember my dad having a single bullet in his bedside table, even though he never owned any guns. When I asked him about it, all he would say was someone gave it to me. Not a doctor, but I scribe for one. A patient of ours was having hallucinations where a helicopter was chasing him. He'd randomly hear helicopter sounds throughout the day and felt like he was being spied on. Turns out he was ingesting too many edibles and smoking too much weed. Once he cut down, the paranoia stopped. Not a doctor, but I used to go to a nursing home to visit with people. I had an elderly lady call me her grandchild. That wasn't uncommon even for those who were completely lucid. I had many grandmas and grandpas, and she was my favorite. She was very sweet and funny. She seemed to only have the occasional lapse of memory, at least that's what I thought. One day I was in her room watering her flowers. She asked me how I really was. I said fine, but she then whispered, "I don't think they can hear us unless there's some device in the flowers brought." I was confused but said nope, I'm fine. She loudly said my real name and that she was happy to see me. Then she grabbed my arm and pulled me in and called me Anna, not my name, and said she could get me safe. Then went on this whole thing about them capturing me and bleaching my skin. Now she was black. "I'm white." She asked if my skin was burning and not to worry because I wasn't patchy, so I could pass for a white woman and that I could still get a husband. She was worried about my children, which I didn't have any. She gave me crackers because she was worried that I didn't have food. I don't know if she had been stockpiling them for a reason, but they were the kind they occasionally got with dinner. I honestly didn't know how to respond. I was 15 and very confused. I think I smiled and tried to tell her I was safe. It was a very weird and sad at the same time. I'm not sure what she went though in life, so it could have been some kind of memory. Anyway, after that day she would occasionally call me Anna, give me crackers, and ask if I was safe. Most of the time she would call me by my real name, until about 6 months before she passed, and then she really didn't recognize me at all. Not really paranoia, but delusion or dementia. My mom used to work in the office on a psychiatric ward. One of the patients would come to the office window every single day, ask for a bus ticket, and pay for it with a penny toffee. They would pass him a raffle ticket, and he would spend the rest of the day sat on a bench in the reception area waiting for a bus. Every night after he went to sleep, the staff would put the penny toffee back on his bedside table. I always thought it was really sweet of them to keep up the charade. Oblig, not a doctor, but one of my close family members is. A lady came in with her infant 0 to 12 months, indicating that the government was going to take her baby away if said infant didn't get the heart surgery the baby needed, because they would think she was neglecting it. She had visible signs of self-inflicted injury and, I forget the name of it, but the one where people rip out clumps of their own hair and eat it. My family member treated the baby. When I say treated, I mean they did the rundown on the baby and verified that it was in good health. Social workers were called with respect to whether there were any orders out or issues regarding the welfare of the kid. And nothing. The kid wasn't on anyone's radar for social services, or any of that. Then things get interesting. Police show up. Husband had called the police and said wife was acting erratically on the phone, but when he got home, she and baby were not there. I gather police protocol normally involves checking hospital admissions so people get found quickly. Wife subsequently failed, both with officers and physicians present, to correctly identify day of the week and current location. I'm going to omit the whole after story. But the end of the story is just that a couple months later, husband, baby, and wife mother are all happy, healthy. And it's about as positive of an ending as an acute mental health incident can have, given the circumstances. Not a doctor, but I worked for a luxury watch company doing repairs. One client was 100% certain that we installed a tracking device in her watch. Came back repeatedly to have it removed and got the police involved. It was actually really sad to see how delusional this woman was. We don't want to track you, and let me tell you, there is no room for anything other than the movement in a watch case. Intensive care unit nurse. We had an elderly woman with some kind of schizophrenia. My mental health knowledge is shocking. And she had subdural hematoma, facial fractures, fractured clavicle, dislocated shoulder. All of her fingers were broken. Huge burns to her hands, stable L5-6 fracture, some kind of fracture dislocation to her ankle. Burns and open wounds that required suturing all over it appeared from the injuries that she was significantly assaulted, but no, she did it all to herself. Not a doctor, but work on a psych ward. We have a patient who thinks he can hear his girlfriend's voice through the wall he shares with his neighbors, and has convinced himself she's swinging with all his family and neighbors. This one lady was almost certain that vaccines cause autism and wouldn't get her child vaccinated. Despite all of her intensive WebMD research, it's almost like a doctor no more than a middle-aged soccer mom. My gran had patient paranoia a few months before she died. I was around 13, so I wasn't told but recently, as I'm studying psychosis at school, so my parents told me. Apparently, she believed that the doctor tortured guinea pigs in front of her as she was getting medication. It was really sad because I remember her being so nice and gentle, and definitely not someone that could have been suffering, but we don't know what caused this paranoia as she was good friends with the nurse. I worked in a care home as a cleaner for a while, you guessed it, not a doctor. And basically ground floor was for the regular and manageable old folks, and the second floor was for the more difficult residents. So me and the other cleaner on shifts would swap floors daily. One day she would do floor 2 while I did ground, and the next I would do 2 and she would do ground. There was one resident, Maggie, and I'll never forget Maggie. On our first day, we were warned that Maggie was suffering from either Alzheimer's or dementia, can't remember which, but she had a tendency to be mean, nasty, and sometimes very aggressive and would attempt to get physical. If we felt uncomfortable, we could do the clean of her room while the carers attended to her. Now Maggie was fine with me. Apparently a rarity. She had her favorites in the home and only allowed certain carers to do their jobs, and me the cleaner. On floor 2 was where the cafeteria was and where staff could go to get a drink. So this day I'm on ground and the other cleaner was on 2. I finished doing what I was doing and made my way upstairs to get a drink for my break. As I pass Maggie's room, I hear a commotion, so I do the knock and walk to make sure everything was okay. When bam, a fresh cup of hot fucking tea smashed 2 inches away from my head and Maggie shouting, "Get her out." She is Satan in disguise. She's trying to suck my soul up and I am not ready. The other cleaner cowering by Maggie's bed with a vacuum in hand and an arm covering her head from the onslaught of boiled sweets and whatever else Maggie could get her hands on. I took over and finished vacuuming the room, and Maggie expressing how I was clearly Gabriel in female form because I saved her from the grasp of the devil. She even asked if she could touch my wing so she would be blessed and absolved of sin before she died. From then on, me and the other cleaner swapped a room each. The room I decided to swap was with a guy with a penchant for younger girls. I was 18 at the time, and the other cleaner was in her for 50, so it made sense, who would always try and grab my arse. Not that he ever succeeded, but the attempts always made me feel uncomfortable. There was another guy in floor 2 who used to smear his shit everywhere to protect from the evils of women, and would also masturbate furiously using his own shit as lube. Thank you for watching this video to the end. In the comments below the video, write down what's the craziest case of paranoia you've ever seen. And also be sure to subscribe to our channel to not miss new super interesting videos, and I advise you to watch our other videos.